I'm very happy that you're all here. I think there's been some very important developments in the area of artificial intelligence in particular over the last couple of years, and we want to take that on a little bit more in depth for this morning's discussion. So even though it's entitled Big Data and Drug Discovery, you might be wondering why we were having a session on this, and because we've been doing big data for a long time. With HTS, for example, in the area of discovery, clinical is certainly a big data problem. But it's gotten more profound and more challenging as we undertake more biology. The genomic era has certainly generated lots of data for us. And we're using the big data in many ways, ranging from discovery into preclinical development, into clinical development, looking at stratification of clinical trials, looking at inclusion-exclusion criteria. But what's been lacking for us in the at least in my view, in the drug development, has been the predictive power, which in turn has been limited by what I call by computing power, limited by computing power on large data sets with efficient algorithms that could lead to better analysis and more accurate predictions. And that goes across the board from discovery all the way through clinical trials. And so that the technologies used to analyze the data and interpret the data have been broadly known as machine learning, and only in the last several years have we seen deep learning and artificial intelligence emerge as a powerful and more sophisticated approach to learn from and make predictions, accurate predictions based on collections of data. So in this session, we're going to explore the kinds of opportunities and challenges in the era of big data, machine learning, and artificial intelligence. And I'm delighted to have a terrific panel here that I'll be moderating. I'd like to introduce them. Ginny Deshpande is the CEO of Numeti. Andy Hazelhurst is founder of Faradin, and sitting next to her is Dylan Morris, general partner at CRV, and Millie Liu, partner and managing director of Procyon Ventures. So what I'd like to do is to first have my panelists introduce themselves, a little bit of their business and their business models and what they're doing in the area of big data and artificial intelligence in the context of their companies. Ginny.
Thanks, Rich. So I'm Ginny Deshpande. I'm the founder and CEO of Numeti, and Numeti is leveraging big data, AI, and systems biology to fundamentally disrupt the drug discovery process. We're leveraging this to create precision therapeutics and have structured multiple partnerships in the last several years. We've done 5 pharma partnerships to date, so working with our technology and demonstrating the power of AI and big data for drug discovery. Our ambition is to become a fully integrated drug discovery company down the road, and towards that end, we're starting to develop our own pipeline now in a couple of key areas in inflammation and oncology with a focus on rare diseases. What's interesting about our business model is that we structure R&D collaborations, so we steer away from services plays. And that's been very productive and helpful because we work hand in hand with partners in terms of advancing these programs forward and are really getting a deeper appreciation of where the applicability of big data and AI is helpful and where there are certain limitations in terms of the discovery process.
Thanks very much. Bill?
Hi, I'm Dylan Morris. I'm a partner at Charles River Ventures. We're based here in Cambridge. We also have an office in Palo Alto. There we're more widely known as CRV. We're more traditionally a software and enterprise firm. We haven't done bio in 30 odd years. However, as more of the tech community in the Silicon Valley are paying attention to this intersection of AI, software, and bio, we also decided this was a good place to focus. I joined this year to help build the bio practice, and we're mostly investing in Series A, sometimes seed opportunities in sort of opportunities around drug discovery, diagnostics, digital health, but on the therapeutic side, it's important for us to have some connection to software, data, automation, something that connects it to the sort of what's enabled by current technology versus the more traditional models of craftsman-like therapeutic development.
No, thank you very much. Annie?
Annie Hazelhurst. I run Ferritin, and Ferritin is a relatively new venture fund. The strategy is specifically focused on applications of computational and software products to the life sciences, and that specifically is focused on research, therapeutics, clinical, as opposed to software as a service or other systems to support healthcare. We have done stuff in genomics. We have done things in biodiscovery and drug discovery, other areas of molecular diagnostics, as well as lab automation. We've also started looking at some things in brain-machine interface and other areas of neuroscience applications in more recent guises, but haven't made any investments there yet.
Thank you, Amy. Mel?
My name is Millie. I'm a partner at Procyon Ventures. We are an enterprise software fund based here in Boston. Our investment thesis is really looking at the past 10 years. There's so many breakthroughs in the AI, data technology, machine learning, and how they can be applied to different verticals. And biology is one of the verticals that we really like. We have invested in fields in genomics analytics, in drugs discovery, kind of computer-aided drug discovery softwares. We don't do anything that requires FDA approval. We don't touch the actual lab, purely software focused.
Thanks very much. As we go through the discussion this morning, I'll take a couple of breaks and give the audience their opportunity to ask questions as we work through. So I want to start this discussion by saying, look, I read in the news that artificial intelligence is fundamentally changing the way we're doing any kind of business, whether it's manufacturing or healthcare and IT. In the area of drug discovery, what kind of changes are you seeing? And what kind of impact is machine learning and AI making in the area of, let's say, discovery or development? And I'll start with Ginny on that one.
So, the field has certainly evolved since we first started 7 years ago, and we're starting to now sort of see the landscape shaping up into companies. If you look at the spectrum involved in drug discovery and development, you have companies that are at the very front end of the process that are helping with discovery efforts. There are companies that are at the very far end of the process helping with clinical trials, and everything in between. And I think in the discovery realm, we're certainly seeing companies, and I'm talking specifically now to those that are involved in the therapeutics aspect of things, we're seeing companies that are focused on sort of a big data and biology play, and then there's big data and chemistry plays. So two distinct sort of categories of companies. So companies like Numerate and Atomwise, which are using big data and AI for drug discovery, using a chemistry sort of approach, looking at improving drug design, for instance, or docking of small molecules to proteins. We're certainly seeing applications there, and we view them as being collaborative to Numedi. They're very complementary to what we bring. We're focused on the big data and biology sort of space. And so we're seeing sort of this stratification, if you will, in the drug discovery realm. Different business models coming into play. I think in terms of successes, unfortunately, there's no concrete example that one can peg to. There are little successes along the way, but there isn't sort of a showcase example that one can highlight in the space saying, this came out of a computer and it's now working all the way in the patients. That I think, is a little bit of ways, but I think once that happens, this field will sort of really open up significantly.
And so, for Dylan, for the kind of investments that you make, what are you looking for at CRV, Charles River?
Well, specifically if we're talking about drug discovery, I think it's becoming increasingly apparent to some of the startups that are working in the space that pharma's early R&D SaaS budget is sort of non-existent, and they're not used to spending lots of dollars in collaborative software engagements. So many of them are starting to think about developing their own pipelines, getting early in vitro and even animal data about the most promising compounds, starting to think about partnerships around targets if they're a target discovery company, but really looking for validations around assets more than revenue around software. And I think companies like Schrodinger and Molecular Science, I think Accelerus, it's called in San Diego, have been selling software and helping researchers develop drugs for many years, some of which have made it to the clinic. Those, of course, don't utilize contemporary machine learning techniques, and I think as data continues to advance and those algorithms improve, I would imagine pharma starting to internalize some of these teams to sort of help build the bioinformatics. But from my perspective in VC, I'm looking for companies that can be standalone winners, hit market caps above $1 billion, and that seems to be more geared towards drug companies than software companies, at least in this area. I am seeing a lot more interest in the later stages of development because if you talk to people in pharma, their concerns and their spend, their budgets are on the commercialization side, and in the research domain, they're on the clinical side. So solving the problems that your customers want to pay for seems like a good strategy.
Ann, do you have any perspectives on, the kinds of investments that, your group is making?
Yeah. So, I think I share Dylan's sentiment, and a lot of the investments that we make do, the customer base is pharma, and the pharma customers are, pharma as a group are still in the process, I would say, of trying to figure out how they want to handle the influx of data tools, products, and also potential applications that it can leverage. So within that, guys, we're looking at everything from genomics to biodiscovery. A lot of that is drug discovery and therapeutic targets, but it can also span agriculture and other areas of bio-based approaches. We haven't looked at anything in water or waste, but that would also fall under the guise of biodiscovery in the areas that would fit our strategy. We've also, as I mentioned, started looking at things related to neuroscience, particularly, and some areas of brain-machine interface, and how that sort of world evolves. I think will be quite interesting in how pharma plays in it, as well as how the tech companies and consumers also engage. And so, I think a lot of that will play out, and it may not be anytime soon that we actually make an investment in that domain. Another area that we've looked a lot at recently is reproductive health and fertility, and generally, we're very bullish on that overall market, whether it's IVF or other areas of how people start to think about and manage having healthy children. And certainly a lot of, I think, the newer genomics and computational tools are really enabling people to think differently about those areas. We're pretty open, so meet with a lot of different companies and try to really keep an open mind and know that the areas that may be the most interesting are not things that we've necessarily thought of ourselves. So.
How about Millie?
Unlike CRV, we are a much smaller fund, so we can invest a lot earlier on, and we're not necessarily looking. $1 billion return is definitely the best case, but we're not necessarily always looking for the $1 billion return. And I think we actually just invested. I think it is overall true that pharma is not all that used to having a software budget, but we actually recently just invested in a company that's basically a spin out of a large pharma's internal team, and we do see this mindset, at least with some players. They start to realize, our DNA is really about a drug discovery. We're not a software company. So if they're very clear that they do need this kind of technology, and they say, hey, why don't we spin this out, and I think you can grow better on your own and come back and serve us as a customer rather than keeping you internally and limiting what you can do with the very low speed of innovation here. So we start to see that change a lot, and also thanks to how in the pharma industry people move around and this kind of mindset, seeing the benefit of using software, paying for software really helps. And the other thing is some of the, we're currently making another investment that's not directly what they could sell to pharma. So we actually have two investments in the genomic space. One is directly selling to pharma, where that's where we see it's very long sales cycle, exactly the problem that Dylan mentioned. But we're actually now making another investment that sells to more the upstreams of pharma. The CROs and service providers basically enable them to serve their pharma clients better. And I think those decision makings are much easier and the sales cycle is much shorter. And again, as a smaller fund, we can afford a relatively smaller, like $100 million exit rather than $1 billion exit.
So in this discussion, what I've been hearing for the most part is you have software, data processing, being able to handle large data. But what about the predictability of that data handling towards making better, determining better outcomes? And the reason why I ask that question is because our odds of success in the industry are miserable, right? We're talking about 1% overall success. And so what kind of strides are we seeing with the kinds of tools that are emerging towards getting better results? And maybe I'll start with Ginny, and because your group's dealing with AI, trying to get to better predictability.
Absolutely, I think that's something that we started the company with the mission of fundamentally improving the probability of success. I mean, if instead of 1%, we have a 2% success rate, that's still incredible in this industry, right? So with that in mind, we're very focused on improving the process. And I think if one steps back and looks at sort of where historically the most failure has happened, it's at the early stages. And the most expensive failures unfortunately happen at the later stages, but we believe that it's primarily because of the lack of a deeper understanding of what's happening in biology in the early stages. And as we've come to appreciate now, I mean, everybody essentially is different from the person sitting next to them, and precision medicine is very much a reality. We're seeing many strides in the space, particularly in oncology. And I believe that this is actually going to be applicable to many diseases, including inflammation and other conditions. CNS is another area. We just heard about the news of Axovant's failure in the phase 3 trial. I think this is where technology can fundamentally help at the front end. If we can get a better understanding, a better appreciation for patient stratifications at the front end, I think it'll help us discover better drugs, improve the likelihood of success as we go along advancing these compounds forward. And so I think the technologies the pieces are there. I think we've not kind of made the complete cycle yet, but I'm very optimistic that that's the future, and we're going to start to see that happen very soon.
And so from the kind of let's say technologies that we need for computing, we need to get better handle on, let's say, target validation. Need to have better ability to mine the data on clinical trials, I would say.
Absolutely.
When I look at biggest reasons why drugs fail, they tend to fail in the clinic for toxicology reasons, or lack of efficacy in the clinic, which might suggest you chose the wrong target to begin with. So maybe my colleagues over here can address some of these questions. Maybe I'll start with Millie on the far end and work backwards this way in terms of the kind of tools which are being developed by the informatics folks, the computational folks, to help in target validation and to help in aiding patient stratification better.
Yeah, I think you used the exact word, exactly the right word, was helping, because we're really just there to help. I think if the analogy is, for drug discovery, if you're trying to find a needle in the haystack, we're really not there to tell you where is your needle, but it's really which haystacks you should narrow down to look for. And with the issues that you mentioned, I think a lot of the things that we're looking at is really with the data collection, the data linkage, and a lot of it. You have to not just work with the bioinformatician, but also working with the biologists, people who actually come from the biology background, understanding what does the underlying data mean. We invest in many other fields, not just in computational biology. Biology is a lot more complicated field than anything else. So I think this is where, at least from our fund's perspective, we are very clear we're just there to help the data collection, the information processing, and the linkage better. And it's still in biologists' hands to do the work.
Yeah, Amy?
Yeah, so I'm actually very bullish in general on what's already been begun with respect to computational tools' ability to do both those things, target validation and patient stratification. If you look at genomics in general, consumer genomics and ancestry and all these other areas sort of get the most press, but pharmacogenomics is the best application and certainly most clinically relevant. I've seen numbers anywhere from 75 to 95% correlation between your genetics and how you will respond to a drug. I think certainly cancer is, sequencing tumors is sort of a thing in and of itself, and the biomarkers often change. So, but if you look, even one layer, deeper or more generalized, I think that both in validating targets and predicting what outcomes you could expect, and also then matching patients to clinical trials, a lot of the pharma companies are already very heavily moving into this space. I've heard major executives from a lot of the big pharma companies say that in the next, as soon as 3 years, they expect to do whole genome sequencing on every patient that goes into a clinical trial. One of our companies is developing a software platform that's specifically focused on enabling the company Solve Bio, pharma companies to match patients to clinical trials. And the first thing that they're leveraging is the fact that every time a patient right now is sequenced for a trial, they're sequenced only for that trial. So if you're Roche and you sequence a patient for a single trial, you don't know if that person could be a better match for another trial that's going on somewhere else within your organization. So, it's that simple to just basically provide them the tools, to do this type of correlation identification. I also, another area that I think as biologics become bigger, and genomic engineering tools, and specifically gene editing, becomes more precise, you can really start to look at how slight variations in different genes can result in structurally different molecules that will have different efficacy in different patients. And so you can start to think about, sort of suites, if you will, of compounds that are functionally equivalent, but structurally different, and are stratified across different patients based on their genetics. So, that's happening already. So.
And Dylan, do you have? I want to come back to that question though in a minute with respect to cost of development. But let's go to Dylan for a second. And what are you seeing in the field?
I see a lot of people trying a lot of things, and clearly there's friction in the process. So there's opportunity for efficiencies to come in lots of places. I think some of the more interesting ones are in vitro models of human tissue, specifically patient-derived tissue models. It's pretty widely known that mice are a very poor model for human biology, lots of human diseases. They're far better than yeast, but being able to do these kinds of experiments and build in the controls around the person's genomics, the person's unique metabolism, it I think is a direction to pay attention to. In the long-term future, we can imagine computational simulations, but we're very far from there. Although there are certainly startups attempting to do patient models to predict off-target effects, Certainly a huge myth in drug development is that your drug targets, hits its target exquisitely and doesn't bind to anything else, and that's completely false almost always. And as a result, as Richard said, drugs fail for toxicity because it's really hard to predict off-target responses. So I think companies that are trying to use genomics, use big data in various ways to make those predictions and get ahead of them will be really helpful. Also, the trend of pharma, as Annie mentioned, to start collecting data about their clinical trials. You hear stories about the not too distant past where a very promising compound that looks great, in the biochemistry will fail later in clinical trials, and they'll have very little understanding why, but they also never went and did a transcriptomic profile and looked at all of the off-target effects. And that's because the incentives to collect data that you're not going to submit for your trials are counterproductive, and I think that's changing. So companies that are helping pharma get there by helping them interpret and understand those data will be really valuable. I mean, you look at the first, success in the RNAi therapeutics that happened recently. These guys pretend that RNA splicing isn't a thing because it's too hard to predict how isomers work. So they just kind of ignore it. And maybe that's okay to a first order, but there is deep complexity in molecular biology, and it's going to take some time for those data to be integrated into intelligent and predictive models.
So before I open up the floor to questions, two questions from the audience. I just want to come back to costing, because you made an interesting comment, Annie, which is to say, well, I can maybe get collections of compounds that I can advance, but the problem, but there is a cost consideration for development. That doesn't really solve that problem, does it?
So I think it depends on how you're looking at it. I think if you go down to a biodiscovery level, the cost of generating within a gene, structurally different compounds is very low.
Mm-hmm.
And once you have those structurally different compounds, you can correlate very easily to a person's genetics what type of stratification you're likely to get. If you look at, you can pretty simply run GWAS studies at this point, depending on what repository population. So you could stratify whether or not it's, meaningful to pursue multiple compounds at the same time, or whether one compound within that is
wider
likely,
range.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so, I don't know, I'm not a pharma company, so I can't tell you exactly how you would, do it. My guess is you would take the version that you would think has the broadest applicability and do initial studies with one compound to get through safety, and should that compound be proven safe, you could add, other structurally different, functionally equivalent compounds that are targeted at patients with variants in their genetic sequence. So
Okay.
I think it's manageable.
Okay, I want to come back to the one question before I go to the floor, and that is predictability. The software, the tools that we're generating are able to, better handle data, but what about the predictability aspects? Because that's ultimately what we're looking for, so we can, have better transitions from preclinical to clinical, be able to predict better outcomes. Have we really seen this demonstrated yet, either preclinically or clinically, with the tools which we're generating?
So, yes, I think that depending on what applications, again, you're looking at. So if you look at cancer, then you've certainly been able to prove, initially that you are getting better match rates on the drugs.
Mhm.
And if you look at, the first CAR T therapy was just approved, whether or not any of the other CAR T approaches get through, I think a lot of them do have cost issues. But I think the early data, at least if you look at animal models and some early clinical, there's a couple of companies who I have in mind that I have seen some of their data on, which I would say they've gotten from identification of a target through to early validation data much faster than the historic norms. I think most of them are trying to be quiet about, what they're pursuing and how, because it's still really early days, but I'm generally very bullish on the fact that you are gonna cut those time frames down substantially to get answers. Whether or not you actually reduce the noise, as in, the sheer volume, I don't know. I think I think automation and a number of other things are also gonna allow you to pursue the research much faster.
And how about let's say, increase in probability of success? If any of the panelists would like to answer that question as well. I mean, I guess what I'm hearing from you, Andy, is that, well, I can get to my answer quicker, which is good, right? And you'll know if you're going down the wrong path sooner, potentially.
Yeah.
But, what you ultimately want to be able to do is not only cut the cost of failure, but you want to be able to increase the probability of success along the way. That's the part that will actually probably generate the most value to the industry, I would think, right? Because then you have more drugs coming out to tackle disease. So how is the tools which we're generating addressing that?
I think more than the tools, my opinion is that, we just need a large number of data to show, and we're not there yet. We need a large N to say, here's the probability of success, right? Because the tools we certainly have computational tools to help with the discovery process, to expedite and streamline some of the timelines and costs involved. But the ultimate proof is demonstrating activity in patients, and we just don't have enough number of studies and trials to be able to say this tool is 95%
Right.
predictive or 20% predictive or 30%. We just don't have enough data yet. I'm optimistic that we will get there, but it's going to take some time before a large number of these studies and trials are conducted for us to be able to truly determine how predictive a technology truly is.
Right. I mean, I share your enthusiasm, Andy, in all this, because many years ago, we were trying to be engaged in better SAR generation for small molecules and make it more predictive, and the technology at the time just wasn't predictive enough. And so, with the robust power of computing and better algorithms, actually, I'm very bullish on this too. And what I'm trying to assess right now is kind of where we are, and I guess it's early in terms of this whole process.
Yeah, so maybe I think, and I know, that Wuxi and others have faced this, which is the models tend to plateau right now. So if you're trying to run, advanced AI or machine learnings on predictions of chemical structures or, biologic impact, for the most part, no matter how much available data you throw at them, they're gonna plateau. And I would say most people don't really understand why, whether it's quality of data sets, whether it's the type of data that's being captured. One of the theories, and we looked at investing in a quantum company, for this reason, is that things like quantum computing will be critical in breaking those plateaus in the model, because right now the models just can't deal with the structural complexity. If you, depending on who you talk to, people will tell you that that is possible or is not possible, so I think only time will tell. But I mean, certainly the predictive capabilities are limited, but I still think the boost you get today is significant, and I think some of the other layered on applications, remote clinical trials, I mean, people are you're able to run more trials faster and push stuff through, and I think the FDA is finally actually trying to start to address that, which even a year ago I would say they weren't serious about addressing it. They were still sort of paralyzed by what do we do. So.
Okay, great. I happen to open up the floor to questions. Sure.
So we talked about validating targets. How do you as investors validate the software? Do you look at retrospective analysis that has been done before that was proven to be successful and see if the same results come out using the software that the people that developed it? What's the process for that type of validation?
So generally, we're going for commercial validation more than technical validation. So we'd like to talk to your customers and understand how the users of your software find it to be valuable and how it compares to their other approaches to the problem. And the key question I like to ask the customer is, if I took away this software tomorrow, how would you feel? And some might go back to the old way with not much more than a shrug. Others will fight to keep it because it's that valuable. If you're pre-customer and you're trying to sell me a story around how your software is better, ideally you've made a prediction and then you've validated it experimentally. That's far more powerful than something that looks back at a retrospective, because there's just so many factors that I can't control in that retrospective analysis, and I want to see it prospectively. I'm sorry if that wasn't a friendly answer, but we generally have a high bar for validating these kinds of things.
Any other questions before we move on? Okay. I want to come back to target validation, because I think what you're doing, Ginny, in Medi, trying to find new mechanisms of action for starting initially with repurposing and then getting into NCEs is very interesting. And so, can you talk about some of those some of the data that you're collecting that maybe hasn't been mined before?
Sure. So, we are leveraging a lot of information that's available in the public domain. We're also integrating proprietary data into the platform now. We're working with partners. Sometimes partners have proprietary data that they've collected, and sometimes academic medical centers have proprietary data that they've collected. And so we're leveraging a lot of data that's both genetic as well as genomic data. My view of the world is, genetics is great, but and then you can mine that information, but it's not the be-all and end-all in terms of what's happening in disease conditions. And so we really need to take a systems biology and network view of what's happening in a disease condition, because you have multiple layers, and this is particularly true and bearing out in the case of oncology. You have layers upon layers of information that one needs to collect and integrate to be really able to understand, disease modeling and understand what's happening in terms of the complexity of disease manifestation and progression. And so our view is we want to integrate, what we do at NewMedi is we integrate all this data, build data models that help us really understand, so at a network level, what's happening in a given disease condition, and we can take a de novo stratification approach to look at patients and patient subsets. So oftentimes we'll find, in the case of ovarian cancer, we found 10 distinct subsets of patients, each of which has a slightly different profile from the other, which means you have to look at each of these as individual disease states, if you will, and then come up with drug candidates for that. We also are mining a lot of information on what's happening in terms of perturbations of drugs, looking at it both in vitro and in vivo settings, and we're also able to mine information of how drugs might be behaving in patients. So incorporating all of that information to really build rich data models that tell us how is a drug really behaving, what are the perturbations being brought about by the drug, and we match the drug and the disease at a systems level. And our view is that that is going to be more compelling than focusing on a single target, because I think Dylan pointed out, it's not often, this perception that a drug hits a single target is completely inaccurate, because we know small molecules hit 7 or 8 additional targets. So we take advantage of this polypharmacy from the get-go and start looking for drug-disease connections that are going to be, essentially matching multiple targets with a given drug. And that, I think, enhances the probability of success, because you're now modeling what's happening in a disease condition and what the drug might be doing at a multi-target level, and trying to push that entire network rather than a single target. So looking at mechanistically what might be relevant comes into play. And I think that's actually, and we start with human data at the front end. So our challenge in the process is you work with human data, you come up with drug predictions, then you have to go through this pesky little intermediate step of testing in an animal model, which may or may not recapitulate human biology. And we've worked through that and solved for that now in a couple of different ways. And the ultimate goal is to get back into humans. And so because we start with human data, we believe that our predictions are going to be much more relevant for what's happening in human disease rather than working in an animal.
And so what I'm hearing from you is that, let's say there's a certain belief that the beneficial effects of a drug, or you might see, or interfering at multiple points along a pathway, might be is really the basis for some of the effects that you would like to see or have seen. with drugs, right?
Absolutely, we've seen this now numerous times. My favorite example is a small molecule called imipramine. It's a tricyclic antidepressant, and our technology predicted that it would have activity for small cell lung cancer. I mean, you look at what the drug was originally developed for and what we ended up finding use for, two completely different ends of the spectrum in terms of the target tissue and where it would be used. And we actually demonstrated in a proprietary model that the drug actually worked beautifully. And so this is where, again, we believe you can take all this information and expedite drug discovery. In the case of imipramine, it has some side effects, but that's a perfect candidate for an NCE play if you can then synthesize away from its side effects. You're not starting from a target screening, high throughput screening approach. You now have a drug that actually is modulating biology of interest, and you have a higher probability of coming up or synthesizing a molecule that is now going to modulate the biology because you know what biology you're going after.
So it's interesting because we discussed previously that maybe the lack of efficacy we're seeing with the drugs might be a reflection of either being too selective of a target or not enough targets engaged. The other half of the molecules, let's say, might reside with respect to the characteristics of those molecules, with respect to ADME properties, with respect to toxicological aspects of those chemotypes. And from the software perspective today, do you think how much of that space are we able to handle today in this multi-dimensional context? In the sense that we need to have the right PK, we have to have the right tissue distribution, we need to have the right toxicity profile. Do we have tools today that are really reflective of predictability for compounds moving into preclinical development and beyond? That's part of the question I'm asking.
The short answer is no. I mean, we have pieces of that, and I think integrating them across the many orders of magnitudes that are relevant to biological systems is no small task. Andy mentioned some of the limitations of current computational techniques for doing molecular dynamics and the sort of atomic scale models of small molecules in active sites. The chemoinformatics stuff tries to abstract away from structure and does a relatively decent job. There's a package out of Stanford called DeepChem that's being actively developed by an open source community, and I don't know how you monetize that as a company except to use it and try to discover something, and then you have a drug that's valuable. And that continues to be like the business model you should look at in this space. I don't think there's a lot of room today for software companies to solve this problem without a lot more validation. And Jeannie's tackling some of the systems biology, higher level problems, but connecting those to the molecular story and connecting those to the systems physiology story it's a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of effort.
Right. Any questions from the audience?
Well, just to add on to that, I agree with Dylan. The answer is no. We have investing company make the linkage better. Again, they don't do any prediction. Again, I'm the only one who's not from life science background here, but if any computer scientists tell us that they can use machine learning or deep learning to predict the target, we think that's bullshit.
Okay, that's good to know because there are groups out there that can say I can draw a structure and tell you what it binds to, but so that's it's a good perspective. So then the question is, how far in do you think we are? I mean, we're making progress. I mean, how are we measuring progress with the tools that we're generating?
I mean, there are contests that have been going on for quite a long time that reward the best academic research groups for making predictions. CASP is a critical assessment of structure prediction, and then that's for like going from primary sequence to structure, and then there are other contests that are similar but are related to the success of predicting blind binding events, and we're getting better. And I think David Baker's group at UW with Rosetta has been winning CASP for a while now, but that doesn't solve the biological problem, and as I said in I think my first comment, it's also not a problem pharma's excited to spend a lot of money to solve, because the bottleneck for them isn't that. The bottleneck are all of these assets that are failing in phase 1 and phase 2. You look at the success of despite the accident failure, Roivant's making a great business, as do many later stage venture firms that just finance new trials after adding some data and trying to understand better why a drug failed. So I think that's the low-hanging fruit if you want to follow the market and follow where the pain is for the pharma. But so.
Yeah, I was surprised to learn not too long ago that, as a chemist, I think most chemists thought they had pharmacokinetics and AbbVie down pretty well, but I saw some data not too long ago which would say, no, you don't. But.
And you may, but again, that's going to be in a biochemical in vitro system where all you're testing is that target and that compound, and then you go into the milieu of biology, and there are so many off-target effects, and it's not even clear that you downregulate that particular target and it's going to have the effect you want, because maybe you're hitting a symptom and not the root cause. I think we see a huge move, at least in some of the cancers, towards combinatorial therapies, and that's because you need to target several steps in the pathway if you want to have a physiological effect.
And then I guess we're getting short on time. Am I up at this point? I have a minute, 2 minutes. So let's come back to AI. Are there certain areas in AI where we are making significant progress? Let me ask you that, and then and I'll let you close out by saying what's your perspectives of AI going forward in terms of potential success and why?
So, I think yes, we are making significant progress. I still think there's a long way to go, and I think we've scratched the surface, but at the same time, I think everything is way overhyped. So it's sort of a weird state that the market's in. With respect to what AI can do now, it can do image reading really well, right? We've solved computer vision for AI, and so image reading, whether it's radiology, MRIs, et cetera, we can massively accelerate that. I am personally a big believer in we don't do enough for monitoring, management, and early diagnostics. Our definition of disease, what is disease? Disease is as soon as we catch it. We had a family friend recently diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. Now, if we were in a world where everybody at a certain age was getting, annual MRIs to detect for cancer, and, the costs of that are going down, and companies more and more are covering some of this stuff, you would catch all this stuff earlier. I think it's once you move to that world, what this watch can do is actually quite exceptional with respect to predicting and preventing health. So I think as you move to that world, you're going to actually start to generate the data sets which are going to give you more predictive power, which is then going to fuel your ability to develop better therapeutics, but also catch things earlier, which will increase outcomes. And that's the other area. I would say that, AI on heart rate, and some of the stuff that's coming off sensors is also, if you're epileptic, this can tell you you're going to have a seizure 5 minutes before you're going to have a seizure. That's huge.
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 Yeah, so I'm hearing diagnosis is really going to be a big winner, you think, with the AI tools, and it might be a while before we get to the more predictable therapeutics.
Yeah.
Anybody else want to share?
I think on the therapeutic side, really we're just seeing better data technology. It doesn't necessarily use AI or machine learning at all. It's just really better data management, better interface. But then if you're talking about using machine learning, where we see one is on the image side with diagnostics, but also with even natural language processing with text analytics, understanding the patient profile better, helping the physicians making a better decision. Those kind of, again, that's on the diagnostic side. We haven't really seen that much benefit of deep learning per se, really on the drug discovery side.
Okay, Dylan, do you have any closing?
AI, is definitely overhyped as a term. Gradient descent has been a technique in statistics for a long time. It's more powerful now because we have more compute. I think the algorithms are open source, so data is your capital in this case, and it's worth investing in proprietary data because The labels are the hardest part, and if you're inheriting someone else's, it's hard to trust them. And if you don't start with ground truth in building these models, you end up with faulty systems. So, I certainly think diagnostics, automatic discovery, there are a lot of exciting places where these techniques, I think, will hit market soon. But this panel's on drug discovery, so I haven't been talking about those. I think in the drug discovery domain, I don't mean to be super pessimistic. I think it's really valuable to use these techniques to integrate and understand data, but I think the systems, the dimensionality of the biosystems are such that if you just come in cold with these deep learning models, you're going to be limited in predictivity relative to coming in with some biologically informed models that connect the different levels of abstraction. And that will reward biologists coming into this space compared to computer scientists.
Okay, Ginny, any closing thoughts?
Sure. So, my view is AI does not stand for artificial intelligence. It stands for augmented intelligence.
Yeah.
That's the state of the art today. I think if we couple all the tools and the methodologies that are out there, and I'm certainly bullish about those. You wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be here if I wasn't. But I think that needs to really be coupled with human smarts in order to be able to maximize what can come out of technology today. Going forward, maybe we can automate some of those processes, but I don't believe that will replace human intelligence at any point in time.
So I just want to close out the panel discussion by thanking all of you for your very valuable contributions and perspectives. And I remain very optimistic about where we are in terms of using information technology, either from a data collection or analysis standpoint, moving towards predictability. I think we're at a stage with computing power and algorithms that we can start putting, this to better testing than what we've done historically. And I look forward to success coming out of Ginny's labs towards picking out better targets and maybe the role of polypharmacology, and certainly with the information technology for better robustness and data collection that'll lead to better diagnosis, earlier detection, as you mentioned, and maybe better target validation that's coming out of this as well. And so with that, I want to thank my panelists for the very, very valuable contributions and your time for coming here today. Thank you very much.